Hello, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural Tech Talk, in which we will be examining the question, how is technology changing the way we communicate? So I'm Juliana Schroeder, the co-director of the Psychology of Technology Institute, and I'm a professor at UC Berkeley House School of Business, and I'll be moderating the conversation.
Hi, and I'm Nate Fast. I'm the other co-director of the Psych of Tech Institute, and I'm a prof at USC Marshall, and I am here with the sole purpose of kind of handling the Q&A for today. So Q&A is open, so you can submit questions whenever you want. We'll have maybe 10-15 minutes at the end where we'll get to as many as possible. And the chat will also be open, but the panelists will not be, well, probably not be engaging on the chat, so we'll see. But if you want to have a conversation with each other or note interesting or controversial topics that come up, feel free to do that in the chat. And we'll also be inviting you to continue this conversation online on a special platform that we'll invite you to at the end.
And this will be the first of hopefully many future Tech Talks, which will happen generally monthly, typically on the last Monday of the month. And these talks are all hosted by the Psychology of Technology Institute, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to studying the human-technology relationship. So if you haven't checked it out, you can go to psychoftech.org and take a look. So welcome to all of you joining us today. You can feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function, and as Nate just said, provide your comments throughout the conversation. We will save time at the end to address and discuss some of the interesting audience questions. In addition, if we don't get to your question or your comment, everything will be saved. So the entire panel will be able to see them along with your name after the talk is complete. So be careful what you say. Each talk will be featuring a small panel of experts who study the featured question from different perspectives. And so today, we are lucky to have with us these three experts. And so this is the time when I get to embarrass them a bit with an introduction. So we'll start with Alison. Alison Wood-Brooks, the O'Brien Associate Professor of Business Administration and the Hellman Faculty Fellow in the NOM, which is Negotiation Organizations and Markets Unit at Harvard Business School. And a fun fact about Alison, she teaches a really fun cutting edge course in the MBA elective curriculum. And it's called How to Talk Gooder in Business and Life. So it's designed to help students hone their conversational skills. It's really my dream to take that class one day. Alison, I hope you save room for me next year. And good. Her latest research is on social dynamics and conversations. Eli Finkel is a social psychologist, jointly appointed a full professor at Northwestern University and Kellogg School of Management. He directs the Relationship and Motivation Lab at Northwestern. He's been called one of the leading lights in the realm of relationship psychology. I think The Economist said that. And if you haven't read it already, you should really check out his new book called The All or Nothing Marriage. I've been reading it and find it really fascinating, Eli. And then last but not at all least, who is this man hiding there in the dark? Jeff Hancock. He is the founding director of the Stanford Social Media Lab, a professor in the Department of Communication at Stanford University, a leading expert on psychological and interpersonal processes in social media, and he uses both computational linguistics and experiments to understand how people's words reveal different social dynamics. He's looked at deception, trust, intimacy, social support, among other topics. And he's also a founding member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the Psych of Tech Institute. So you're not here to listen to me talk, so let's hear from each of these experts themselves. They're each going to just talk for a few minutes about some of their interests related to this topic at the intersection of social life and technology. So Alison, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. What a wonderful group conversation we're going to have today. I'm thrilled to be included with these research heroes, Juliana and Nate. Thank you so much for gathering us here today. Eli and Jeff, what heroes. This is so fun. And all of you wonderful silent voyeurs watching us awkwardly talk to each other on Zoom. This is so great. I study the psychology of conversation. So if and how people choose topics and ask questions, make jokes, make bad jokes, listen to each other or not. And as Juliana said, I teach a course at Harvard to help people get a little better at conversation. And I feel like I learn from my students every day. When it comes to technology and communication, which is the theme of this session, my interests really fall into two main buckets. And the first is, how can technology help people converse more effectively? And the second is, how can technology help researchers like us conduct better research? So the second one sort of serves the first bucket, actually. So how can technology help people converse more effectively? I'm deeply interested in helping people converse more effectively, and sometimes technology can help in that pursuit. And we're just sort of now figuring out how and when. These days, I mostly focus on live dialogue. Unlike one-way communication, like public speaking or advertising or news articles, live conversations happen in real time between two or more people. For example, on social media, turn-taking can happen asynchronously. So there might be hours or days between the turns that people take in conversing with each other. But I've mostly focused on bubbling discourse with immediate responsiveness. So people taking turns one after the other, the kinds of conversations that we have most days, many times each day. And so when we think about helping people converse more effectively in real time, one thing technology might do is act sort of like a coach. So coaching people to converse more effectively on the fly. But early evidence suggests that on-the-fly conversation coaching seems largely unhelpful or overwhelming because conversation itself is such a deluge of information and decision making. We have to think about what we're going to say and how we look and how we present ourselves and monitor our body language, all while trying to perceive other people and listen to what they're saying. So to have another input from technology telling us what to do is just sort of too much. The exception to that might be in group conversation, where you spend time silently listening and nodding, as the other panelists are doing so politely right now. Thank you so much. And you might be able to look at an input that gives you some information, let's say about airtime distribution or something like that, that might be useful. But that kind of work is emerging. Setting aside live conversation coaching in the moment, it seems that technology can be quite helpful before and after people's conversation. So before, technology is really helpful in helping us brainstorm and decide on topics that we might bring up during the conversation, especially topics we might not have thought of otherwise. I read this really cool article recently that sometimes doctors who have young cancer patients, you tend to forget that they could die in the next year. And so bringing up morbidity as a topic is really important, and they often sort of forget to do it because the person is so young, and they tend to just engage with them as they would with a normal young person, right? So putting that onto the topic list ahead of time could be really helpful to have a more productive conversation between the physician and the patient. And then after conversations, technology is really helpful to give feedback to people. We don't get high fidelity feedback in our conversations when we converse with other humans. It's just not something that we tend to do, right? Tell people like, oh, that was a great joke, or that was a bad joke, or that compliment sort of hurt my feelings, or I don't like you right now because you're a little bit too negative, right? That kind of feedback just doesn't happen in human discourse, but for objective technology is positioned very well to give that type of feedback. And that's a really exciting area for future research. And then in the second bucket, how can technology help researchers conduct better research? We are so lucky to be doing social science right now. It's an amazing time to be a social scientist. People are conversing in different and more traceable ways than ever before. And you're going to hear from Eli and Jeff about the ways they're leveraging this. Wikipedia, Reddit, Twitter, dating apps, email, text, smartwatches, like data is everywhere. And we have more access to more interaction data than ever before. But of course, with more access, it raises questions about ethics. And I think we'll touch on that as well. There's new technology like auto-transcription that allows researchers to capture interactive data at scale. There are new analysis methods like natural language processing and machine learning that allow us as researchers to analyze interactive data at scale with emerging tools and packages on R and Python to make these methods easier and more accessible for more behavioral scientists. And I want to note that I think interpretability and transparency are essential for good science. Do we understand what our algorithms and analyses are telling us? We need to be able to show what we're doing in our analyses. We need to be able to interpret and explain the mechanisms. and we need to be able to teach it to other people. This has always been true, but it's even more important today. Big data, complex tools, we shouldn't hide behind them or marvel at them, at how complex and fancy they are. Our job as scientists is to shed light on the darkness and to simplify the complexity. When we study things like authenticity, empathy, conversational flow, and emotional intelligence, what do we mean exactly? How do those social constructs manifest in people's verbal, nonverbal, and prosodic behaviors, and how should they? If we can't explain it precisely to others, we probably don't understand it well ourselves, and we won't be able to teach it to others. So those are my buckets. How can technology help researchers, and how can technology help conversationalists? And so I'll pass the torch to Eli.
Thank you. Just in the interest of feedback, Alison, it made me anxious to listen to you, knowing that I was coming up next. I do a lot of research looking at how usually romantic or intimate relationships work, from the opening moments up to how to sustain passion and happiness in a long-term marriage. The work I do that's most relevant to this topic often intersects with the online dating industry. And some of the ideas that we've tested came from sort of reverse engineering, like what assumptions does the online dating industry adopt when trying to match people? And loosely, we can think of 3 generations of online dating. I think, by the way, we might be entering a 4th right now. But the first one, basically, those of us who are old enough to remember the advent of the Netscape Navigator, right? As soon as people start going online, it takes milliseconds before people start using new technologies to try to find romance, love, marriage, sex. And Match.com launched. And this was the first generation of online dating. And their model basically was to be a supermarket. It was to say, look, these are the 3,000 people located within this distance of your zip code, and why don't you just browse until you find somebody who's compatible with you? And so one of the early lines of research that we undertook in the lab was, well, how good are people at discerning their level of compatibility with somebody from a profile? And the answer is not very good. The answer is people are very bad. They're not bad at figuring out, like, this person seems more attractive than this person. They can figure that stuff out. But am I going to click with this person? We think we know that, but we don't. And so, there was a pretty good excuse when the second generation launched around 2000. This is eHarmony, for example, where they pitch themselves not as supermarkets, but as real estate agents. They say, the terrain is fraught, it's complicated, it requires a lot of expertise. We have built an algorithm to identify who is especially compatible with you. And in the early versions of those algorithms, there were, I think, 400 and some self-report items that people filled out. And this was a totally reasonable idea. We're now basically sure that it doesn't work. That is, we've run the machine learning studies, but in general, the question of, can you take information about individuals who have never met each other and frankly aren't even aware that each other exists, and like fit that stuff into a computer and then determine who's going to be compatible, at least with the sorts of self-report measures that all of the early services we're using? The answer is no. And in some sense, it's an interesting question, because some things science is good at predicting, like when is Halley's Comet coming next, or 72 hours out, where is that hurricane going to hit? Meteorology, for example, has gotten a lot better in recent decades, but seismology, that is, when is the earthquake going to come, or is there going to be a big aftershock this time, is basically nothing. Right? We know there's going to be more earthquakes in San Francisco than in New York, but in terms of actionable intelligence, it's basically nothing. Is romantic love, romantic passion, romantic chemistry, is that sort of more like a comet where you can really predict it? Is it more like the weather where you can kind of predict it? Or is it more like seismology where it's like almost impossible to predict? I fear that at this point, it's more like seismology. And then the most recent era really came with the advent of the iPhone, really the second of the iPhone, where suddenly you've got the world's biggest singles market in your pocket or in your purse. And this is, people called it mobile dating, but this is the Tinderification or the Grinderification of online dating. And one thing that I like about this third generation is that it doesn't make assumptions that you can tell who's compatible from a profile. It's a really fast browsing process that literally involves a swipe. And it doesn't assume that they can tell you who's uniquely compatible with you from an algorithm. So the assumption is you just got to get face-to-face. Now the question is, are we entering a 4th era where just getting face-to-face is a whole lot more complicated than it was in February? And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Hancock.
Jeff, are you there?
Jeff, you're muted.
You're muted. Nate, can you unmute him?
Alison sings, and she's happy to sort of fill in any gaps.
I wonder if we did that on
have.
purpose. We muted Jeff on purpose.
I don't know.
Yeah, geez.
Oh,
Speaking of conversational dynamics, I was unable to unmute myself. Thanks,
that was like
Nate.
a little experiment within the conversation. Okay.
Loved it.
That's good. Yeah. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you, Juliana and Nate, and Alison and Eli. Absolutely huge pleasure to be here with you. My background has focused on a couple of different issues, and I'm going to thread them through what Alison and Eli talked about. One thing I've been interested in for a long time is deception and trust, and we can see them in both of the kinds of things that Alison and Eli were talking about when we move online. And I absolutely love Alison's point about the way technology has changed how we can do research. So for people studying lies, most lies disappear, and we record some in a lab, and probably over the first 50 years of deception research, we recorded maybe a couple thousand lies. And now, with fake news, we get a couple thousand lies in a day. So we can then also analyze them and take a look at them and see how people react to them. So I think Alison's point about how this is just an amazing time to be a researcher is super critical. And I'd like to just do a shout out here. I think that Matt Salganik's book, Bit by Bit, Social Research in the Digital Age, is one of the best books for thinking about the issues that Alison raised around how do we go about looking at this kind of trace data? How do we understand it not as like, say, the telescope seeing all the stars, but maybe as anthropology, where we're seeing shards of social interaction, social dynamics. I think he has really nice parts around ethical things there too. So to come back to deception and trust, we can look at how people lie to each other, and we can record all of it in the way that Alison was talking about. We can look at those kind of dynamics. Do liars speak differently or talk differently in text, say versus video conference? We can look at whether media changes how often you're likely to lie. So if I can see you, am I more likely? If I'm texting, am I more likely? And then we can also look at detection things. So how can we go about detecting lies? And one of the themes I think has emerged from my work, and certainly the lab over the last 5 years, is that in asking all those questions, it's almost always psychology beats technology. So the effects and your ability to predict things are going to be more accurately predicted by psychological principles and communication dynamics than they are by the affordances of technology. So if you want to know whether somebody's going to lie, look at what their motivations are, what the situation is, the context, etc. And you're going to be able to predict that much better than if it's, say, they're in text versus their video versus they're on the phone. And that goes to detection and also trust as well. It turns out trust dynamics are highly influenced by our psychology, but also our communication theories. And those are going to do a much better job than affordances of the technology. Now, those interact, and that's where I think it's really exciting to see, well, how does a psychological principle get pushed around by technology? How does it interact? And that's where it's really exciting. One place we've looked at that with deception and trust is in Eli's world. When people engage in romantic relationships, at the very beginning, they're having to present. So all of us, all the panelists at least, are wearing clothes, at least on the upper half of our bodies. And we did that in a way where we wanted to self-present to the world in a way that we think is attractive. Now, maybe in this context, not romantically attractive, but nonetheless, maybe competently attractive. And here, when we're in a sort of a thin slice environment, video conference, or even more, like Eli was talking about, websites or just Tinder profiles, we have to make choices about what we look like. And so now I have the possibility to deceive in ways that I don't face to face. So we could then look at this principle of psychology beats technology, and we see it beautifully here. So as a man, I could lie about how tall I am, because that turns out that's going to be important in heterosexual relationships. And I could say I was like 6'4", and that's going to make me more attractive. But in fact, most men will lie by just a very small amount. They'll lie a little bit less than an inch. They'll sort of like stay below that 1 inch thing. And women can use photos. And so if they know that men are really interested in say physical appearance, or at least that's what they've been told, they could, modify their photos a lot. And we find that's not the case. They tend to do some modifications, but they don't go insane and have everybody look like a superstar. Why? Is it because the technology did something here? No, the technology allowed them to do all those things, but the psychology and communication dynamics are the key. So if I lied and said I was like 6'4" and made a whole bunch of money and all this stuff, when we actually met, I would be viewed as a liar, and that would be the end of that relationship. So I'm really excited about how psychology and technology interact, and I love online dating as a space, conversation as a space. More recently, I've become interested in two things that I hope we can talk about today. One is whether social media has an effect on well-being. And my answer very quickly there will be, I don't think so. It's certainly not one simple thing. And it's a much more complicated question. And I hope we never see headlines again that say social media does X, Y, or Z. And I can talk about why. And the other is I'm interested in how AI is not only something that we're talking to or is giving feedback to us like Alison is saying, but actually how AI is now sitting between humans. So the most popular version of this is Smart Reply, Smart Messages in phones and Gmail. So if you've ever seen those three options at the bottom of Gmail about like, sounds good, okay, that's great, sorry, I can't make it. This is AI, been generated by a machine that looks to be relatively appropriate to your response. I could send that to Eli in response to his messages, and he would have no idea that I had used a machine to write that. So is this a big deal? The answer is we don't know, but there are billions of these sent every day. There are billions. So they're huge, huge input into human life and human conversation. The machines are priming me. A lot of times I look at those and I'm like, oh, okay, sounds good. That's probably what I would have written, but I can't know because of priming dynamics. And when Eli received it, I can also, that machine could be influencing his conversational dynamics because of priming for partners as well. So ethical questions here. If Google is using the most responded to language, then they would probably be prioritizing older white male discourse, because that is the discourse of trust over the last 30 or 40 years of the patriarchal nature of our society. So in that case, that's a problem, homogenization of language. But you can also imagine a young, say, Black female applying for a job. And if she uses this kind of a system, she's going to overcome the double bias that she faces in getting that job. So she would accrue some benefits by using a system that allows her to talk like older white male. But this comes at a huge cost to society, where we're reducing the diversity of our language and prioritizing a certain way of talking. So there's fascinating conversational dynamics along the way that Alison's talking about, but also these huge ethical questions. And shockingly to me, very, very little research done on this topic, given how it's probably the biggest way that AI interacts with our social lives. So excited to talk about all of that, and looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Okay, so many different topics have already been brought up. But, you know, I am going to refocus us back on sort of this big question that technology is changing a day-to-day conversation. I mean, we are in a space where we're just completely reimagining what conversation can look like. I mean, look at us right here. We're talking to each other. Other people are talking to each other on chat. There's, you know, panelists that can come, there are participants that could come in and out of this. And we can, you know, even just the idea that we can take someone and mute them like Jeff or kick them out of the conversation or bring them in. Just this sort of, we're in a space we've never ever been in before. And so what do we think, there's sort of two questions there. What do we think technology is doing to our daily conversations, or allowing us to do? Is it harming conversation in some ways? Is it making conversation better? And then the sort of prescriptive side of that, like what can we be doing to use technology in a way to actually improve our conversations? Anyone can jump in.
I'll take a stab at this one. I don't know about you guys, but I find Zoom to be deeply dissatisfying. And like what we're doing right now is both amazing, but also I'm sure deeply dissatisfying for all of you and for everyone watching. in many ways, you can start to think about in what ways is this modality impoverished compared to if we were sitting at the front of a classroom or on a stage and people were listening in person. And you can quickly rack up things that we're missing, right? So you cannot see our full bodies. So you can't see our trunk lean and our body language. Sometimes you can see a little bit of gesticulation, right? So nonverbal stuff. But I think what I miss the most, and this is really to your research, Juliana, are the prosodic cues of conversation. And so when I think about the content of a conversation, it helps me to think about three different buckets. There's verbal content, which are the words we say to each other. There's nonverbals, like what you do with your body and your face and your hands. And then there's this third bucket of prosodic content that's not quite verbal and it's not quite nonverbal. It's everything in between. So it's stuff like laughter, pauses, interruptions, the cadence and tone of your voice, and almost many aspects of delivery. So things like humor really rely heavily on these prosodic cues. And it's these prosodic cues that are really, it's like we're attempting to have a conversation, but all of those things are disrupted by tiny delays in our internet connection. And because I can't actually combine my eye contact and my prosodic cues to like wink and tell my joke, like it doesn't land the same. Also, I can't hear, I can't,
it landed.
But you can't hear the laughter of the 200 people that are also watching. So like all of these things are really critical and important for human interaction, and they're just missing on a lot of technology, a lot of modalities like this.
I'd like to jump in there, and I'll use my little hand as a way to signal. So completely agree with everything Alison has been saying. My colleague Jeremy Balanson here at Stanford, who does a lot of virtual reality work, he and I have been looking into this Zoom fatigue idea, and we've developed a new scale that we'll be releasing soon. And we think that the fatigue, if it's real, is due to three. Right, yeah, right. I know. I'm so tired. There's the things that Alison mentioned, which are some of these dynamics around the technology, micro delays that we can't even sense, but we're very finely tuned to. Two others seem super simple, but we're pretty sure are some of the mechanisms for this. Is right now I have 5 people staring at me. And this is really weird. Like in conversation, we'd normally be like this, and we would talk, and then we'd chat and check in, and it's like a dance where we look at each other very little. It'd be like getting into an elevator, and then we all sit there and stare at each other. It's crazy. So we'll probably evolve some norms over time where we will do this kind of thing. Some of the best practices we're seeing is having a second computer to your side that's the video. The third thing is the fact that we're stuck. So right now, if I move too much, I go kind of like out of the frame, and so we're sort of like all frozen into like this cage. And when we look at people in physical office meetings, they move around all over the place, shifting their chairs, getting up and down, water breaks, etc. So I think it's going to be a real issue. And what we're interested in now is with kids having to go back to school in the fall and Zoom being used as their main way of interacting, like we don't know anything about what are best practices for kids and teachers to do this, especially when there's 20. And so again, urgent call for people in the chat list here for us to be doing research in this area.
Jeff, it's so interesting that you mentioned eye gaze. We've been thinking about eye gaze as well. It's a pretty powerful and understudied thing, especially in group conversation. When we think about like distribution of airtime and how do we empower people who haven't spoken to speak before, like up until now, a lot of people have been like, oh, we'll just notice who's been quiet and then cold call them, right? And it's like, what? Yeah. Who's to say that's the moment they have the thing, like a thing that they want to add and contribute? But one thing that seems to actually help, which is some research by Nicole Abbey Esper, my doctoral student, which seems really aligned with what you're saying, Jeff, is that eye gaze is a really subtle way when you're face to face that you can empower people to speak without calling them out. It just invites them in and makes them feel included. I think many of us, particularly low status group members, women, ethnic minorities, low status group members of all flavors, know that feeling of, okay, nobody's looking at me, Is it because they don't want me to talk or what? So I'm just gonna like sit here in silence and not actually add my thoughts that I have. So just having, especially coming from a high status group member, a little bit of eye gaze that invites that person to contribute when they're ready seems very, very powerful for empowering airtime at the right times when they have good things to add. And you're missing it on Zoom, right? You can't do that.
Totally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just gonna say nobody wants to make a plug for how technology is improving communication and conversations. All sounds very negative.
Yeah, well, so I should be really clear. I'm actually super positive. In fact, with this project, I want us to include a control condition, which is like, how excited would you be to have a face-to-face meeting? How tired are you after face-to-face meetings? And I know, like, when I have a day where there's 4 or 5 meetings in a row, I'm exhausted afterwards. And so now, to a degree, we're blaming Zoom. The other thing, and this is to Eli's point about the fourth wave, like, this is a pandemic. We cannot all hang out. And yet, here we are, having, in my view, a great conversation. It's really great to see you, etc. And so I think this is a theme for people studying technology, and the way that the media covers our work is the negative sells really well. And yet, here we are doing something. The problem is the good things are really mundane. It's, hey, we were able to talk to each other. And so it's not as like newsworthy. And I think that's something that's a real problem when our work gets covered.
Mm-hmm. Totally. I think one thing that Juliana knows this about me as well, because she's now seen me in enough Zoom sessions. I'm a very overzealous chat participant. I'm holding myself back now, even though I'm seeing amazing messages. But this chat function is really a huge advantage that something like Zoom has over face-to-face interaction. You can kind of get the inner monologue of so many people. It's so much better for information exchange than a normal face-to-face conversation where all of those thoughts are happening, but we can't download them and share them instantaneously. And here we can. It's pretty incredible.
And having that chat that's going along with the conversation that's happening, I mean, do you think of that as being a divided attention issue in a way, or is it just, do you see it as being complementary? Like I'm getting the thought downloads of all the people that are willing to put their minds into the chat, and that's nice to have while I'm talking.
I think people's preferences vary wildly on this, right? And we're all kind of figuring out what our preferences are, what other people's preferences are. I know this is a big question about online teaching. It's like, do you allow the students to use the chat? To what extent? Does it need to stay on the topic of what you're talking about? Are jokes okay?
Lots of research. Yeah.
And it all depends on everybody, and everybody has heterogeneous preferences about it. I think for sure it is helpful after the fact, right? If you can save and look back at the sort of chat transcript, for sure. There are questions about divided attention and your ability to listen when someone's speaking if you're also reading. We have some research about listening right now in live conversation, and something that we have learned, this is work by Julia Minson at the Harvard Kennedy School and Hannah Collins, my PhD advisee. People are remarkably good at dividing their attention. So if we tell them to both listen to a conversation partner and pay attention to advertisements playing on a TV behind that person's head, they are really good at doing both of those things. And their partner has no idea, right? They have no idea that they're also watching the TV behind them for the most part. Think about being on a bad date, Eli. You're at a sports bar and like somebody, if they're like looking to the side to watch the game, that's bad. But if it's like right behind your head, you might have no idea. So anyway, I think there's some emerging work now on the ability to pay attention to other humans when you're conversing with them and other things. And I think it might apply with this sort of chat window on Zoom.
I'll chime in briefly just to make one or two high-level observations. The other two panelists have way more expertise. In fact, the other 4 people here have more expertise on this question than I do. The only thing I'll say is I think we're going to end up with a conclusion similar to Jeff's conclusion about social media, that the question of like, are communication technologies good or bad? It's like there's almost certainly not going to be a yes or no answer to that question. The other thing I wanted to say is like why I find this question so important, and to some degree this comes from like a research success from our lab, and in another sense from a research failure from our lab. And one of the things we've been interested in, this is with Paul Eastwick and others, is to what extent do we know what we're interested in a romantic partner? So if I tell you, like, I really want a woman who's funny, and my best friend says, I really want a woman who's, charming, but I don't care if she's funny, to what extent is it true that I like the funny women, and dislike the unfunny women, whereas he likes the charming women and dislikes the uncharming women, but that we don't share each other's preferences. Well, there is a huge effect here, such that you can get reliable differences in what people say they're looking for in a partner that then disappear face to face. And I want to give one empirical example to drive home just how clueless we seem to be about this. So in one of our more recent studies, this is spearheaded by Jahan Sparks, we asked you, so you're a participant in the study, you're about to go on a blind date with somebody that we've set you up with in the lab, but you actually go out on a blind date. And we ask you, to what degree, what are the 3 things that are most important to you in a partner? You can pick anything in the world. Laughs at my jokes, likes to go sunbathing on Thursdays, whatever it is that you really are interested in. And then we have you meet the person. We then have you rate the person. How much did the person actually have those qualities that you love so much? And then express your interest in the person. And lo and behold, the people who had the qualities that you liked them more. But we also asked you how much that person that you just went on a date with had the characteristics that some literally random other participant listed as crucial for her, right? Like, I really like men who are, I don't know, some other thing, like Seinfeld reruns. And so you rate the person you met, not only on the 3 characteristics you rated as important, but also the 3 characteristics that literally some random other person rated as important. And it turns out that the degree to which you like people as a function of them having those characteristics is equally strong, regardless of whether they have the characteristics you like or whether they have the characteristic somebody else likes. And I think part of the issue here is that we exist in an online frame and can evaluate the world according to, a set of assumptions that we have that then get scrambled once we are actually having a live interaction with somebody else. And it's like, I like people who have nice qualities, rather than I like people who have these idiosyncratically nice qualities that I think I like. It's just one illustration, I think, of why it's so important to understand the differences across medium of communication.
Mm-hmm.
Their qualities get scrambled, Eli, and possibly a little bit swamped by, I'm enjoying this interaction right now because you're asking me nice follow-up questions, or you made a couple good jokes, right? Like, these small things might even in that moment while you're experiencing it sort of overwhelm the other good thing qualities that you're looking for as like a steady trait in a mate.
Alison Wood Brooks et al., 2017, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, brilliant paper. I will say that is totally what I think is happening, but it's so weird that we walk through life assuming that that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? So yes, it's like you like somebody, and therefore does it matter whether she likes Seinfeld? No, it doesn't matter. And yet if you were to go to an online dating site and click around, you'd be like, Seinfeld watcher, right? And it would be significant to you. Or, oh my God, you like Seinfeld. And we think these things are going to be significant for us, despite the reality that you understand that they likely will not be.
When in my class, How to Talk Gooder in Business and Life, one of the days I bring in a professional matchmaker, and her name's Rachel Greenwald. She's amazing. She does this exercise the night before. She asks the students to make a list of the traits they look for in a mate romantically. And if they're already married or in a relationship, think back to the time when you were single and make the list of things you were looking for in a mate. And then the next day in class, ostensibly unrelatedly, she has them make a list of things that make someone a desirable conversation partner. Like, who's your favorite person to interact with? What are they like? What do they say and do? And then she has them compare the 2 lists. And it's exactly what you're saying, Eli. Like, why are the 2 lists so different? Why do we walk around with this mental model of like traits we're looking for, but then there's this totally separate list of things that I actually enjoy and look forward to in interacting with people, and trying to make sense of those 2 worlds? I think people just get like overwhelmed in their lives. Can't make sense of it.
I think attribution theory can say something here to some degree. So my colleague Sunny Liu is doing this work looking at what kind of attributions we make about phones. So the same kind of attributions you make about like, oh, that person and why I like them, kind of telling the story to ourselves. She's finding that when somebody else is using their phone, they're probably doing it with some stupid, narcissistic, trivial social media thing. Yeah. When you're using the phone, it's like important. I'm trying to get this stuff done. I got to do that. And it's really powerful. So when, why would people do that? It kind of makes sense. If Alison, for example, is ignoring me while we're talking and she's using the phone, it's hurtful. And if it's like Alison is being a jerk and ignoring me, yeah, it's really hurting right now, Alison. One attribution is she's being mean to me. That hurts. And the other attribution is I'm boring. That hurts. But there's another attribution, which is the phone is making Alison do this, and that's less hurtful. And so we're seeing, Sunny is seeing that in a number of studies. And I think this idea of people telling stories to themselves and explaining what's going on is a theme that I'm hearing through all of this.
Mm-hmm. And Eli, I was also thinking about using phones in romantic relationships, sort of that phubbing phenomenon, and what that does in long-term relationships.
What is phubbing?
I mean, again, here, I think some of the best.
Someone with a phone. Yeah.
Phone
right,
snubbing.
phone snubbing. Yeah. So we're having dinner together, and I'm just like checking my phone periodically. And I know that nobody on this call does that, but apparently it's something that people have done sometimes. I think we don't know yet exactly how that is problematic. I was not aware, Jeff, of the work that you just described. My guess is that on average, phubbing is a destructive thing to do in the relationship. That is, all else equal, if you imagined a dinner where you checked your phone 5 times versus didn't check your phone at all, that all else equal, your partner would be happier after the one where you didn't check at all, unless you were, of course, like looking up something for his benefit or whatever.
Right.
So it's really going to be heavily about the attributions that we're making for the partner's behavior. And here again, technology or otherwise, we talk about basic psychological processes that work a little bit differently in an online context, but that certainly generalize, right? So how do we make our partner feel good? We pay attention. Was it Simone Weil who said it's the rarest form of generosity, right? Like attention is profoundly valuable. You think your partner doesn't know that's a valuable thing to you? Now, apparently from Alison's research, you can fool your partner with a good sporting event in the background. But most of the time, the more attention you're paying to your partner when she or he is trying to communicate, the better it's going to be. And so the more your circumstances afford distractions, the more likely it is that you're going to pay less attention, and that should have some non-zero negative effect on the dynamics between the two of you.
Yep, completely agree. But what would be interesting is if I say, Eli, excuse me for a second, I've got this like grant deadline, I guess I want to check on my team. When we explain, I think, a little bit what we're doing, because this phone is like to the outside world, it's literally a black box. I mean, it'd be cool if it showed like Jeff's working, or
all the
Jeff's
time.
talking. Yeah, exactly. Jeff's talking to his mom. Like those are things that people will be like, okay, that's cool. Like no problem. But yeah, I think when we make these attributions of like, you're not attending to me, that better be important. And I'm guessing it's not.
Right.
The phone is such an obvious cue that you're not listening. Though I do think some people are quite good at being on their phone and sort of listening, but it's just such an extreme example of not looking at someone and not even trying to give the appearance of listening to them. What we have found in these listening studies is that people are actually pretty great at giving the appearance of listening even when they have very divided attention. And then it's pretty hard to pick up when someone is listening attentively or not. Actually, the only high fidelity cues that you can really detect if someone is listening to you, we intuitively use nonverbal cues like, are you looking at me? Or are you looking at your phone? Are you nodding? Are you smiling? Are you laughing? But what we find is that the best way to detect if people are listening carefully to you are actually spoken cues, right? So paraphrasing, asking follow-up questions, using callbacks where you bring up something that you talked about earlier in the conversation or maybe even earlier in your relationship. These are the things that you could only say if you were listening attentively to the person earlier. This is the best way to know if someone is really listening to you attentively, and they are also the things that make people great conversationalists, right? So in our minds, when we think of listening, we think of it as something people do when they're silent and you are talking, but actually some of the best cues of listening are spoken. So it's happening when the other person is speaking.
Hey, Alison, I don't actually know if anybody knows this, but your reference to the idea, like referring back to some earlier thing that happened in our relationship, like that's a good cue that I'm not only listening, but also like attending, like paying attention and processing.
Remembering, all the good things.
And it reminds, so one thing that I've been very interested in lately is the idea of relationships as microcultures.
Totally.
Like saying like, oh, you fucked up. Like that could be like a really warm, sort of playful thing to say in some relationships, and really probably the wrong thing to say in many other relationships. And actually, I just wanted to throw out, I think to both of my co-panelists, or even the 4 people here, is there good work on banter, or I guess you could say like verbal flirtation? Like is there, like, do we know how that works? Because I've always wanted to understand more about it, and I have not been able to find good literature on that.
So Laura Cray had some
Yep,
work on flirting versus teasing versus negative feedback. I loved it. I only saw it in its earliest versions at like a conference presentation. Juliana, do you know what Laura ended up doing with that work?
Yeah, it is under review, and she has a flirtation scale that she's developed, and her theory is that it's actually very much about power. So low power people sometimes flirt to get above and that sort of thing. So
does she get into the conversational dynamics, like
I think there's more to be done there.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot more to be done there. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking as you were talking that this might be a nice place where we think about the use of AI helping us to have better conversations. I wish in all of my conversations with my partner that I could just record it and then I could easily go back and like refer back when I wasn't listening that, that carefully. And so this brings us to like the broader point of some of the work that Jeff has done on AI mediated conversation and what are the ways in which we can start using AI to help us have better conversations, hopefully. Or maybe that doesn't work very well to Alison's point that's, getting more information as we're having a conversation online is challenging and overloads us and we can't really incorporate it very well. What do you guys think about that?
I'll just chime in first here by saying that I think there's a ton of opportunity here as AI gets better at understanding what is good conversation. So I think there's a lot of potential for AI mediated communication where it can like help us. It can reduce bias. It can make things faster. It can take care of some of the work we have to do. And then to Alison's point about how this can make us better, there's Carrie Holios. She's in Illinois, did some really early work on looking visual presentation of who's speaking more or less in a conversation. I think that's, it was an early idea that has a lot of potential so that it allows people to get better in real time. I think of it more of as like a training system. So right now I use in Gmail a system called Boomerang, which I'm not endorsing or anything, but one of the things that it does is it'll have a little thing, almost like a green meter on the bottom, and it gets more and more green as I do more things. And it turns out it's trying to model about 7 different language dynamics. And once I've been polite enough, I've said enough, I've referenced the other person enough, etc., then it's green. And it's like, hey, you should send this. This is a great email. And so who knows if something like that will work in the long term. Personally, I find myself, I'm better face-to-face dynamics than I am in text and in emails. And I know for other people, it's the exact opposite. Some people in the chat rooms are saying that, well, if you're an anxious person, this is Zoom is really great, chat's really great. So I think there'll be a lot of individual differences here too, where some people will need more help in different kinds of domains, and AI could be a really great way to do that.
Mm-hmm. And I totally agree, Jeff. I think that AI could be more helpful in different modalities too. We have some early evidence that on email, the system of like getting to the green, getting to the good point, it might be easier and more coachable in that modality because it's asynchronous communication, right? And you're sitting there typing, trying to get it right, often quite quickly, right? Like we don't always painstakingly edit our emails. But live conversation seems to be a little bit more of a challenge because there's so much happening on the fly that live coaching, so there are companies like gong.io that record and analyze and transcribe conversations for salespeople, for example, and for big companies, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of their sales teams have all their sales calls recorded and analyzed by this Gong client that joins the call. And what Gong has found is that live coaching is really distracting, right? Because you're there, you're trying to listen, you're trying to do callbacks, you're trying to ask questions, you're trying to learn and convey information, all this stuff at once. And so having an extra thing to pay attention to isn't as helpful as looking back at the analytics afterwards and then being like, oh, okay, like I talked too much, I didn't listen enough, I didn't ask enough questions as a form of feedback, because to Eli's point about relationships as like a microcosm or a little culture, our relationships with anyone is a repeated game over time. And so if we can get good feedback in between them and do better the next time, it's going to affect what's happening in round 20, 50, 100, or if that person's even willing to talk to you in those rounds. So possibly using AI in that way might be more helpful than trying to do it on the fly in live conversation. I'm thinking really carefully about different modalities and how asynchronous they are, or how like the bubbling discourse of face-to-face conversation. I think it's something that we as scholars can be a little bit more careful about, just thinking about the timing between turn taking, right? So email's a conversation, but it's pretty asynchronous, pretty spread out, depending on if people are going really quickly. Social media, sort of all over the map, face-to-face communication, always quick, and so on. So just thinking more carefully about what is one-way communication, what is dialogue, and then what is the timing of the turn taking in each of those modalities, and where will coaching be most helpful?
Hey, Juliana, can I pose a question?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So I found that fascinating because I was listening to Jeff and was very persuaded, and then I was listening to Alison, and she raised an issue that I think was very relevant to Jeff. So Jeff, let me throw this to you for a second. The state of the AI, to what degree is that using the logic of a self-help book? And by that I mean, everybody likes it when you're polite rather than not polite, right? So those are like the one-size-fits-all sorts of solutions that have figured out that over a course of a billion observations that people on average prefer when you say howdy to hi, versus the much more interesting question, which is, you know, when I say a particular thing to you as an individual, I as an individual say a thing to you as an individual, that is not the same as random person saying something to random other person. And so I'm generally not hugely optimistic about the best help approach of just saying, this is what a polite email is, or this is what a polite conversation is, as I am to like the calibration of, yes, I'm somebody who likes to speak this way, you're somebody who likes to speak that way, but actually from you, I really like extra tenderness. Why is that? I don't know, but I do. To what degree is the AI getting serious about that?
Yeah, so right now the state of the art is the first category. And so they have, what we're finding, this is work with Hannah Michkowski here at Stanford, but also Malta Young at Cornell. This, it's called the asymmetry of effect. So if you look at these smart responses that in the Gmail system, for example, over 90% are positive. And if you're Google, it makes sense to screw up one way, right? Like you don't want to say like, screw you, and be like, oh shoot, that was the wrong suggestion. Right, so it's almost all positive. Google says that they are not training on personal conversations. And so it's based on their, trillions of emails, and in part what ones get reacted to fastest. So for example, when they're developing the system, they couldn't get the machine to stop suggesting "I love you!" ! And I love this because it gets at that asymmetry. But it was so powerful that they had to whitelist it. So it would suggest it, that they would pull it down, and then they would force it to make a fourth suggestion. And it's kind of cool because it's funny. But then you can imagine, like I'm writing my wife and it suggests "I love you!" ! Okay, that's great. But then if I'm writing, say, my graduate student, and I accidentally hit that, now it's not funny. In fact, it could be like a real problem, like ethically, legally, etc. And so there's also this psychological thing where if I saw that and I didn't send it, but it says, "Oh, Google thinks I love this person." Maybe do I? Google's pretty smart, right? So
I am 6'4".
Yeah, exactly. I know. I can tell because you're standing very tall.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that this is cool. But imagine, I'd have to guess the near to medium future where AI is now being deployed conversation partner to conversation partner, and then my worry, unlike Alison's around how training works, is I won't even be involved. I'll be like, here's what I want to get out with Eli. I want him to agree to do a grant with me. Go AI. And then it will just write and talk to you and take care of that until it achieves my objective. And now the problem is whoever can afford the best AI is going to win, in the sense that if conversation is what drives human society and all commerce, all of it, then the person with the best conversational AI that works for them wins.
This is really fascinating, and I'm going to jump in with a couple of questions. We don't have much time, but a couple quick things. One is we'll put the questions, and you can retype your questions. We'll put them over on the platform that we're going to invite you all to, and we'll ask the panelists to check in and maybe provide some answers too, because we can't get to all of them here. But one that I think applies to all three panelists is Prachi Jain, who says, how's conversation changing, if it is changing, as conversations between tech and humans become more common. And so really asking about task assistants like Alexa, Google Assistant, conversation agents, and so on. So how are these personal assistants maybe changing the ways that we relate to other people, or the way we engage in conversation, or do you think that that's not changing us at all?
So this is a little out of my expertise, because I think this is a key question, right? But it's longitudinal and requires, change over time. And I'll just note at the offset that language and conversation is always changing. So when we read Shakespeare, we have to teach people how to read that, because even though it's English, it's really, really different. And it's not like, I really get bothered with people, oh, kids these days with all their like acronyms and new ways of talking, like, oh, isn't that bad? And it's like, prioritizing some like 1960s or 70s view of how we spoke is the right way. I think language is much more dynamic. I'm forgetting, and maybe Alison would know this, but some author has been proposing that machines are making us talk more for them than for us. So Alexa is training us to speak in these short declarative sentences. And so the idea here is we're going to sound more like machines rather than them come and sound more like humans. And I'm blanking on the author, I apologize, but I think it's just a little worry in the back of my mind as I talk to Alexa and some of these other systems.
I think there's some.
I don't know. Juliana, do you know? I don't know if that
nice work in marketing. I was going to say, like, I think Grant Packard has some, and Jonah Berger's looking at this a little bit too. And there's some others. And one of the concerns is that it's teaching kids to be less polite. So they're just ordering Alexa and Siri around.
Right.
So as I was
you guys must be.
The only stuff that I know of is descriptively, sometimes the way that people tend to naturally communicate with an AI chatbot indicates other things about them. So like the way that men communicate with a female voice that's automated is predictive of other stable traits about that person, for example. But I haven't read the stuff that you were describing, Jeff. That sounds insidious.
Actually, I've got it here because I was multitasking.
Nice.
Well done.
It's Brett Freischman. He has a book called Reengineering Humanity, and I think it's a compelling concern.
I would like to make to Eli's point earlier about sort of generalizable things that are good in conversation versus personalization, which as you were alluding to, Eli, is so important for human connection. And so something we've been thinking about a lot is how to personalize and to figure out, like, broadly, what are the things that good conversationalists do, not thinking specifically about who they're interacting with. And then are there things that we could, like, interventions we can design that achieve those things and also help people be more personalized. So for example, the callback is a really powerful personalization tool. It's one thing that you can do to show, like, Alison, was listening to you, Eli, earlier, and I cared about it, and I listened, and I want to bring it up again. But one thing that can help us do that is topic preparation, right? So I often know before I'm going to interact with you that I'm going to see you. And so even like 10 seconds of coming up with a bulleted list of things that I might want to bring up tends to help people. It avoids that panicky feeling when you feel like I don't know what to bring up next. And as Talia was saying in the chat, long interturn silences are an indicator that a conversation's not going well. So topic prep helps with that. You don't have to bring up those topics that you prepped, but in those awkward moments and you're doing this crazy creativity task of like, what should we talk about next? Your prep topics can just come out of your back pocket and be brought up. And they can be very personalized, and they should be very personalized. Like, what did we talk about last time? You know, how are Eli's kids? I remember last time, a couple years ago, he mentioned that parenting is pretty traumatic. Like, how are you surviving the trauma, right? Especially like that, right? And that's like a very minimal thing that doesn't take that much effort. So, and technology can help remind us of what we talked about last time, especially because we're doing auto transcription and some emerging methods for sort of topic modeling. You can imagine a world where technology records a conversation, makes a bulleted list of the topics that you talked about last time, feeds it to you before you see a person again, and then you're enabled to have this sort of personalized conversation that isn't just, hey, tell someone you love them, or hey, make sure you express gratitude, or apologize, right? That are these sort of unpersonalized isms. And to Jeff's point about, saying I love you isn't always good, even though it's often good. Same thing with gratitude expressions, right? So Nick Epley and Amit Kumar have this awesome paper about how we underexpress gratitude. It's wonderful to feel gratitude. It's wonderful to express it to others. But what we have found recently is that in a purely competitive environment where you're like doing a distributive negotiation for one issue over price, saying you're grateful puts you at this, makes you very vulnerable. Like people could take advantage of you, they think you're nice, and so they're gonna exploit you. And what we're thinking is, we're not good at jumping from purely competitive to purely cooperative interactions. Like we often don't even see the boundaries between those. And many of our interactions are mixed motive, both cooperative and competitive. And so then we're like, I don't know what to do. Do I tell you I love you, or do I like stonewall you and try and get as much money from you as possible? And how do I oscillate between those two things? And so machines might be able to help us sort of define and figure out what world we're in and what we should be saying in different contexts over time.
Yeah, I love that point. So I hate to say it, but we're actually at the end of the hour right now. This was just the very tip of the iceberg. We're going to have to make these talks 2 hours in the future. But let me just go ahead and thank all the panelists for taking time to share their brilliant insights. This has been a really fascinating conversation. And I have so many new questions I want to study.
Yes.
So the speakers will be, again, able to see all of the questions and comments that you submitted. So they're not going to waste. We will definitely still see those. And I hope that all of you will consider joining us for our next Tech Talk, which will be around the end of August. And if you thought this talk was interesting, you want to keep the conversation going, check out the membership platform that I think Jake put into the chat for everyone. And we hope that you'll consider joining and continuing the conversation. So thanks again to today's panelists, and we'll see you all next month.
Thanks,
Juliana and
everybody.
Nate.
Thanks, Juliana.
Thank you so much.
We love you.
Awesome.
Bye.
Bye, Eli.
Love you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.